So Jim's topic this afternoon is grazing management for targeted animal performance. And I know that Greg questioned Alan on animal performance. So Jim, it's yours.
All right. Thank you, Michael. Yeah, it's really funny these days. Alan Williams is a trained animal scientist, and he's talking about soils and agronomic things. I'm a trained agronomist, and I'm going to talk about animal performance. But, you know, that's the way it should be. And I think years ago, that's the way it was. We have become so specialized in our own fields, we don't understand what goes on in the rest of the system. So when you can have animal scientists and agronomists basically taking each other's topics and, you know, doing a good job of it, I'm not saying I'll necessarily do a good job of it, but that's what holistic, broad systems thinking is about, being able to understand different things. Now, what's really scary is when I do economics. All right, so I used to call this talk grazing management for high animal performance. And then, you know, we don't always need high animal performance. We need our animals to be doing what they need to be doing at that time of the year, depending on where they are in their stage of production. So I changed it to being targeted animal performance. And what drives performance basically is daily forage intake. Here's the rule: the more you eat, the fatter you get. Now, that's not necessarily always true, and in humans, it certainly isn't. It's what you eat dictates how you perform. In the case of ruminants, yes, it does make a difference what they are eating, but it really comes down to how much can we get in them every day. So there's three basic factors that determine what intake is going to be. Time spent grazing. How many hours a day will they graze? There's a very common kind of joke that cows are unionized. They will only graze 8 hours a day. That's not totally accurate. They can graze up to 10 or 10 and a half. But you know what else they have to do? They have to ruminate. And because these are both energy demanding activities, they need to rest. They do roughly split their day 3 ways: grazing, ruminating, resting. All right? Biting rate. Oh, man. If we have just perfect pasture conditions, you know, it's this tall, vegetative, and the way bovines graze most efficiently is when they can extend that big old tongue around, pull a wad of forage to their mouth. That's how they get big bites. And when they're grazing like that, it might be 12 to 15,000 bites a day, okay? When we make cattle, and you know, cattle only have 1 layer of teeth, they don't have 2 sets of teeth. When we make cattle bite down like a horse does or a sheep can do, their biting rate can go up over 40,000 bites in a day. But those 40,000 little sheep bites are never going to match the intake of a big sweeping tongue intake, okay? Size of the bite, how big is that? That's the one thing that we can actually manage for, is size of the bite. And you know, I keep looking behind me right there for it, but it's down here and over there. So 5 to 10 hours a day is what cattle will graze. And as I said, in ideal conditions, 15 to 20,000 bites a day. We put them on short grass, and that can go up over 45,000. I forgot that this sequence of slides was in here. All right. How about when we're in a situation like this? That is not very good forage. This is dormant season range grass out west. There's not enough hours in the day for the animal to consume everything that she needs from that pasture. So sometimes we've got to give her a little help. And I'll talk about what that little help is a little bit later on. Sheep, in ideal conditions, they'll graze 6 to 8 hours a day, get completely full, and that can be 40,000 bites a day. When they get to short pasture, they can extend how many hours they graze. And part of the reason for that is because sheep are so much more selective, because they got those prehensile lips and that real active tongue. They can pick the individual leaf off a multiflora rose bush, right? They can pick individual leaves off of anything. So they select a much higher quality diet to begin with, so they don't have to ruminate as much. What is ruminating? Eructication, coughing that cud up, chewing it up again. Cows, because they take big bites, they ingest a lot of crap sometimes. And it takes a long time, chewing the cud to break that down. Sheep, because they don't have to spend as many hours of the day ruminating, can in fact extend their grazing. This is why a sheep can survive on land that a cow will die on, when we're, again, talking about big, vast rangelands out west. 80,000 bites a day is what they'll get up. That is more than teenagers can do. Horses are not ruminants, right? Horses, if they have to, can graze 20 hours a day. And I always say that a horse can graze 2 inches below the soil surface and still meet its needs. They'll go on and on. They're what we call hind gut fermenters. The closest thing to a horse in digestion actually is an elephant. All right, so of these time spent grazing, biting rate, bite size is what we can control. Livestock have different needs. Depends on stage of production, the environment they're in. What I want to do now is think about energy. It is most often energy that limits animal performance. In warm seasons, sometimes, we have protein deficiencies, and we have to be managing for that. But day in, day out, what drives performance is intake of energy. So I've taken and separated different livestock classes by category based on energy. When we look, and what I'm going to define as very high energy is when our TDN is 68% or greater. The animals that fall into this class, lactating dairy cows and nannies, using nannies nursing twins and triplets, and finishing beef animals. You know why finishing beef animals fall into this very high category? Because to get marbling, it takes excess energy. It takes energy beyond their maintenance requirement, their growth requirement. Putting back fat on. Intramuscular fat is the highest energy requiring growth factor we have. And I don't know if we actually call fat growth factor, it's fattening. So we need very high energy in our forages to get high quality, high choice, prime grade beef. You got to have a lot of energy in there. High energy is TDN in the 60 to 68% range. Lactating beef cows, especially early lactation. Finishing lambs. Why can we finish lambs with less energy than it takes to finish steers? Because we don't marble lambs. We don't really, you do not improve the eating pleasure of a lamb by putting more marbling into it. You don't need to do that. You can harvest lambs from 40 pounds to 180 pounds, and they're all going to be about good. They're all going to be very good, but it's not driven because they're marbled. It's just because lamb is so good. And then growing stockers, I got greater than 2 pounds a day. Now, you can have animals gaining just 2 pounds a day and finishing, laying down, marbling, if they are to that physiological stage. We can grow stockers at 3 pounds a day when let's say when they're 8, 9, 10, 13 months old, something, and they're not going to marble. Even though they're gaining that rate, they're not going to marble because physiologically they aren't prepared to do it yet. Moderate energy, 54 to 60% TDN, so this is going to be late lactation beef cows, replacement heifers and ewe lambs, stockers gaining 1 to 2 pounds. And then we have the low energy group, dry, pregnant adult animals is basically what we have in here. We can do what we call roughing them through with stockers, and they're gaining less than a pound a day. But if you want that steer or that heifer, that yearling animal to meet its genetic potential for finish weight and quality grade, they have to be gaining at least 7/10 of a pound a day. If you take them through the winter and they're only a 1/4 pound a day, you can get compensatory gain, and they will gain much faster in the spring, and they will grow, but they may not ever reach their genetic potential for finishing. And part of that has to do when the fat cells that ultimately become marbling are laid down. There's some development of those fat cells, or creation of them, within the first 72 hours after birth. If you have a calf that is sick, weak, gets doctored at birth, the odds of it actually ever reaching its genetic quality grade potential is reduced. There's also fat development that occurs around puberty. And if you're winter calving like so many of your neighbors do, calves being born in January, February, March, when is puberty taking place? Well, it's in the following winter. And if they're on low quality hay and they're not gaining properly, that is going to limit their potential to finish. So it is critical that we maintain at least that 7/10 of a pound a day gain as they're going through that winter, transitioning from a calf into a yearling. With cattle, when we think about the tongue action and when we have leafy forage, when we have stemmy forage, we'll maximize. So if that's about 6 inches and that's about 15 inches, when the pasture sward is in that height range there, that's when we generally maximize intake. Okay. When I was at Missouri in research, we did a lot of work looking at intake rate on pasture and the factors that affect it. And so I think all of you can look at that pasture and say, yeah, that's probably ready to put stock in on. We would call that the pre-grazing forage mass. In the work that we did, looking across a whole array of grazing events, looking at factors affecting it, R squared it isn't correlation, it's how much of one factor is influenced by another. And so the forage intake was only 23% dependent on pre-grazing forage mass. 82% of intake is determined by the post-grazing residual. Every farmer and rancher knows what a good pasture looks like, and we're ready to go in it. Most of us don't know when to take them out. And in my experience over many years, working with many different outfits, grazing yearling cattle, they're disappointed with the performance of those animals. 9 times out of 10, that disappointment is driven by that simple factor right there. They stayed too long in the pasture and asked the animals to take one more bite of really low quality forage. We want to blame it on, well, that order buyer, he bought poor genetics. Oh, we had this, pink eye ran through them. Maybe we didn't feed the right minerals. Should have, fed that high-priced, chelated, organic minerals. No, those aren't the factors that cause poor performance in stockers usually. It's simply asking them to take one more bite. Guess what? The fastest, easiest way to increase intake in grazing animals is ask them to eat less. You leave more residual, daily intake is going to be higher. Remember, and I think it'll show up later, but I'll say it here, the highest energy and protein is in the top part of the plant, the lowest is in the bottom of the plant. The least indigestible fiber is up here, the most indigestible fiber is down here. Each additional bite you ask them to take down into that canopy, the bite size is going to be smaller, the nutrient density is going to be lower, and they are going to expend more energy to take it. That's what we call a lose-lose-lose situation. In our work measuring intake, looks like I kicked my drink over, on cool season forages, what we determined is 75% of intake is driven simply by availability, the size of the bite. Quality is about a 25% factor. Now, when we go to warm seasons, it's a 50-50 deal. You have to pay just as much attention to the protein content, the digestibility of that forage, as you do to the volume that you're putting in front of them. So that's why I wasn't saying I needed another one, man, but shoot, yeah. Those of you who were here yesterday, and I was hacking and coughing a lot in my talk, that's the high humidity mornings here. I'm not used to that level of humidity and in the mornings, and man, yeah, I just cough, cough, cough. Afternoon here, that's all gone, it's drier. So if you were afraid I was, had either COVID or tuberculosis or something, it wasn't either of those. It was just your high humidity mornings. So warm season grasses, it's even split. You got to pay just as much attention to the stage of maturity on that forage as you do the volume that's out there. Now normally, if I were in the West, the next slide would have been, and I fully expected it, the next slide would have been on rangeland, its quantity, quality, and the foraging ability of the animal. The knowledge that that animal has of where to go across that vast landscape. So the ranch that we live on and manage the irrigated pasture on the range side of the operation, they run on 160,000 acres of public land for grazing with another set of cows. To a lot of people on this side of the country, that's just mind-boggling. What does 160,000 acres even look like? It looks like all of that. All right, so as I said, intake is tied to the amount of forage that's in front of them. This is some work that Ed Rayburn did, and some of you might know Ed Rayburn. He's I don't know if he might be retired now, but he was the forage extension specialist over in West Virginia at WVU. He did this work when he was at Cornell University. And down on the bottom axis, we have forage availability going from 0 to 3,200. And here we have relative intake. So maximum intake is the animal physically cannot stuff one more bite of grass in there because the rumen is distended to its maximum capacity. That's what 100% intake is here. And you'll see that it takes for cattle over 1 ton of standing forage in the field for the animal to maximize intake. A ton of forage and thick, good grass is about that much. All right. For sheep, it extends out here to about 1,300, something like that, because again, the sheep can take that individual bite of the highest quality material so they can still maximize intake. And it goes down a little bit slowly, but we get to this point at about 80% of intake potential. You try to push the animals below that, and intake just falls like a rock. So this is about 1,000, 1,100 pounds per acre available forage here. On the sheep, it's about 800. What that means, if we want to, and most commercial operations, by the way, operate typically at about 80-85% of intake potential. There's only one enterprise in the beef sector that we ever try to get to that maximum intake, and that is finishing. When we're trying to finish high-choice, prime-grade cattle, we want maximum intake. The rest of the time, if you were trying to graze all your stock to this, you could not run enough animals to pay the bills. So by default, I mean, people don't think about it, but it's where you end up. Commercial operations end up at about a point like that. And what that says is we cannot let the forage residual drop below 1,000 to 1,200 pounds if we want to maintain decent performance on these animals. I will have no fear of wasting grass. If you want good performance, you got to be willing to waste grass. This is work we did in Missouri, and this is a 7-day grazing period, and we're looking at change in daily forage intake of cows grazing orchard grass, alfalfa pasture for 1 week period. So we have days 1 through 7. Here's the daily intake as a percent of body weight. In this study, we looked at daily feed allocation, 3-day feed allocation, weekly, and then continuous grazing. I use this figure because it's by far the most interesting one of any of those 4 grazing approaches. And I never know where to start on it. Do you start on the last day of a grazing period, or do you start on the first day? We'll start on the first day. On the first day of the grazing period, wow, they're eating 4+% of their body weight. Holy cow, you know, if we had steers eating 4% of their body weight, they would be gaining 7 to 8 pounds a day. Wouldn't we love to do that? But we see on the second day, they ate less. Why did they eat less? Well, we have to go to day 7 out here. You see this red line across here at 1.9%? That is maintenance. That is the maintenance requirement of an animal. That's what allows a cow to stand on 4 feet, you know, belt, fart, and be a cow. Maintenance. All production function will only happen if we have intake above that. Look at this. The last 3 days of this week-long grazing period, the cows are basically eating at maintenance. That's not good. So the reason that animal ate over 4% on the first day of a new grazing period is because the rumen had been emptying out for a couple of days. They weren't getting nearly enough to eat. This is what I would describe as a roller coaster diet. And a roller coaster, because now picture 4 weeks of this. String 4 of these graphs together. You got a roller coaster. Inconsistent diets give you inconsistent performance. Okay? So take a simple look at that picture, and what would be our solution if we wanted to maintain a higher level of animal performance? You move them at day 3 or day 4. You don't let them get down to this very low level. Now, I said we had also looked at 3-day grazing periods in here, and you still have a stair step on a 3-day grazing period, but it's like 3% or 3.2%, 2.7%, 2.4%. So it still stair steps down, but it's still keeping the intake at a level where you get good performance. Daily rotation, properly done, you can hold that intake level at about that 3%. And 3% intake level on a beef steer is what would give us about 2.8 pounds average daily gain. On continuous grazing, from 1 day to the next, it's very similar, but over the course of the season, we see a downward trend just because availability starts to become limiting. So when we think about how frequently we want to move animals, this is what's driving it, is how high do we want the intake to stay. This next slide is from the same study, but it looks at the data in a different way. And this is residual forage required to maintain 2.5% intake for different grazing periods. 2.5% intake is a moderate level of performance. It's not high performance, it's a moderate level of performance. And what we see is if we move the animals every day, and these pastures all started with about 3,400 to 3,600 pounds of dry matter, if we move them every day, we can use 2/3 of that forage and still maintain that target rate of intake. If we move them once every week, we can only use about 1/3 of it. 33% utilization versus 67% utilization. If you consistently could utilize 67% of the available forage rather than 33%, what would that do to the carrying capacity of your ranch? It just doubled it, because we can use twice as much of the forage we produce and still maintain a target level of performance. This is one of the fundamental reasons why we can run so many more cattle on a farm or a ranch that's being intensively managed. And whether it's adaptive multi-paddock rotation or management-intensive grazing, use whatever term, it's the same outcome. If you manage the forage and livestock interface appropriately, you can run a whole lot more animals and still get high performance out of them. All right, increasing bite rate. The animals can only increase that biting rate so much, and if they're increasing biting rate, the volume of the bite is going down, so that does not solve our intake problem. This pasture looks a little bit similar to the second one we were standing in this morning. I would have described that, other than the Johnson grass, I would have described the pasture, the second pasture we were in, as being high phase 2 or low phase 3. It was just transitioning from phase 2 to phase 3. In general, my target is to initiate grazing when a pasture hits high phase 2. Because remember, we have that phase 1 lag phase, we have the very steep and highly efficient solar panel of phase 2, and then we flatten out into phase 3. So we want to keep as many acres, as many days of the year as we can in that steep part of the phase 2 curve. So ideally, we go in, top of phase 2, and we graze. And this is what we want the bottom side of phase 2 to look like. We want to see plenty of green leaf still out there. We want the ground to be covered so we're not seeing sunlight directly hitting the soil. Those same temperature measurements that Alan was talking about of the bare ground being at some level and the covered ground 30 or 40 degrees cooler, that absolutely happens. We've done those measurements. We see it all the time. The covered soil here is just a healthier state. And remember what I said yesterday about this. This is good for the plants, it's good for the soil, it's good for the livestock. Now we come and look at what happens if we do stay that other day. If we do push it down to a phase 1 residual, we're going to have a much higher soil temperature. We have slower recovery because we've taken the leaf area away. The animals are going to have lower performance because we ask them to eat deeper into that low digestibility fiber and low protein at the base of the plant. And this is bad for the plants, bad for the soil, bad for the livestock. And if you have anything that is bad for the plants, bad for the soil, bad for the livestock, it is going to be bad for your bottom line. And that's, we can't be profitable if we're degrading the land and starving the animals. This is just an easy guideline to remember. If you have animals in a pasture and you can see their nostrils while they're grazing, forage availability is going to limit intake. If you have pasture that is grown up so high that you can't see the animal's eyes when they're grazing, you can have limitation of intake due to lower forage quality. And so on these, especially the cool season pastures, warm seasons get better, it's eyes to the nostrils. If you don't want to see their nostrils, you want to see their eyes, and if they're grazing in that range, you're probably getting adequate intake for good performance. Now, we have a lot of warm season species, that are this high. And yes, if the animal's grazing on the top of the plant and looking up, you can see their eyes. But a lot of times, they're head down in here working new shoots, lower growing plants in there, and no, you don't see their eyes at all, but they are still getting good intake. So this guideline here is much more applicable to most of our cool season forages that we try to keep in this height range than it is to warm seasons. Sheep, I don't worry about it so much because sheep's nostrils are closer to the ground, and we come back to the whole parasite deal. Goats and sheep are much more susceptible to parasite infection than our cattle. There is this idea that sheep pasture, should never get taller than this, and they graze it down to that. That is the New Zealand model. That is the Irish model. And another part of the Irish and the New Zealand model is they deworm sheep every 4 weeks, sometimes every 6 weeks if it's a good season. Sheep can perform very, very well on pasture that is this tall, and we only ask them to graze it down to 4 or 5 inches. And if you do that, the likelihood of sheep becoming reinfected with parasites is greatly reduced. Same thing with horses. Horses, when they graze very close to the ground, they're going to pick up parasites. If you do controlled grazing with horses and put them into pasture like this and ask them to just eat the top off of that, they will do very, very well, and they will stay largely parasite-free. It's when they go down to the ground, that's when parasite infection occurs. There is one exception that I need to bring up here. Do you have liver flukes in this part of the country? Anybody know? No liver flukes? Okay, Greg says no. I'm going to go ahead and say this. All right, so most of our stomach worms, the larvae, they do not climb to the top of a leaf and jump into the mouth of a cow or a sheep. They are concentrated in the bottom couple inches of the sward. And if you don't graze down into that, you're not going to pick up the parasites. The liver fluke, because it has an intermediate host, it's a snail, and those snails will go way up on the leaves. And so if you're in liver fluke country, you don't protect yourself from getting infected with liver flukes by grazing high, because those snails can be high up in the canopy. Okay, so we have talked about forage intake and the factors affecting it. The other piece of what they actually nutrient-wise consume is nutrient density. And here we got to think about energy, protein, minerals, vitamins, all those factors of growth that come into play. We want forage that tastes great and is more filling, not less filling. So excellent pasture, we talked about this, it's high in energy. As I said, energy is what is generally limiting performance and productivity of our animals. In a cool season forage, it's actually hard to have protein deficient pasture if it's a cool season sward, okay? You got to screw up your management really badly to have protein deficiency in a cool season grass. Warm seasons, on the other hand, as they begin to elongate to produce a seed head, protein content declines quite rapidly. And a lot of mature warm season grass, I think Russ was talking about this yesterday, some of these full season, warm season grass growth, like switchgrass, 2.5% crude protein is all that's in that. Big blue, 4%, 4.5%, 5%. Bermuda grass, that can be cleared down into the 4% range if it gets, mature. So on warm season grasses, we've got to make sure that they are adequate in protein. Mineral rich. To me, mineral rich and species diverse just go hand in hand. The broader your plant diversity is, the wider the array of minerals that are going to be available to the animals as they graze. On our farm in Missouri, when we were there, I went 3 years in one stretch, fed no salt or mineral, and I really couldn't tell that performance of the animals had changed. Now, I give talks on plant diversity and pasture, and I'll show that not even counting any woody species, just grasses, forbs, 9 different functional groups in our pasture, and just making a listing of the primary species, 40 plus species in there. Warm seasons and cool seasons. And I think the reason that our animals weren't really responsive to mineral supplementation is we had enough plant diversity and didn't know it at the time, but we were probably creating more functional biology in there, that the bioavailability of minerals was fine. Out in Idaho, we do not have as broad a diversity. We have a lot of cool season grasses and cool season legumes, and not much else in our irrigated pastures. On the rangeland, it's all there. And I'm increasingly thinking that feeding trace minerals to the cattle on these irrigated pastures is a very important component of their health, because we don't have the plant diversity to provide it to them in their grazed diet. We want it to be palatable, and I've known Fred Provenza a long, long time, and Fred has a very different definition of palatability than what most of us grew up with. You know, most of us think palatable means it tastes good and the animals like to eat it. Palatability is all about the biofeedback of metabolism. They eat this plant. Does it make them feel good? Does it make it feel bad? If it makes them feel bad, it's unpalatable. It doesn't matter how good it tastes, it is unpalatable. If it makes them feel good, that's a palatable forage. As I said, we have to create this. This isn't just going to happen. Our management is what creates this. All right, so we think about factors affecting quality: warm season grass, cool season grass, annuals, perennials, legumes, forbs, whatever it is, plant maturity is the number one factor that affects quality, being defined as high in energy and adequate in protein. As an illustration on cool season grasses, boot stage, that's just before that seed head emerges. There's the tiny little flag leaf comes out, and then the seed head starts to emerge. From boot stage on, cool season grasses on average lose digestibility at a rate of 0.5% a day. Now remember that finishing quality feed, I said, was greater than 68% TDN. Good high energy feed is 60 to 68. If we're at 71% TDN, the day we put our finishing animals onto this strip in the field, and then we go to the next one, the next one, the next one, and it's in this maturity growth and it's heading out. In 1 week's time, we've changed from being finishing quality feed to good stocker growing feed. In 2 weeks' time, we have gone from being finishing quality feed to being just barely into the category of good growth on stockers. 3 weeks' time, if we have plants that have matured and they're 3 weeks beyond optimum, and we're trying to finish animals on this, it ain't going to happen unless we ask them to eat a smaller and smaller and smaller volume of it, so that they're not getting into that indigestible fiber. So that's how fast these things can change, from being excellent feed to being just okay feed. This is an illustration from several years ago on our irrigated pasture. I had 1 year, you know, I've been doing this for 40 years, as I indicated yesterday. I can still screw up a pasture as good as the next person. All right, so in 2011, due to some misjudgments on my part, I ended up with we have 450 acres under center pivot. I ended up with 120 acres that we did not touch until the 1st of August. Now, I had some that we had grazed previously and it had regrown, and so this just illustrates, this is on the 1st of August, this is full season growth, and that's cow maintenance feed, late lactation feed, yeah. Over here, what was grazed and has recovered about 35 days, that's finishing or dairy quality feed over there. Those lambs we want to finish, that we don't want grazing down to the ground, we want them to top it off and stay 4 or 5 inches up. Beautiful lamb finishing pasture right there. That's good stuff. It's the exact same mixture, just one is mature and one is not. Huge difference in feed quality. Some generalities. Annuals are usually higher quality than perennials. And all of these I have to emphasize at comparable stages of maturity. Cool season quality in the broad term generally we say is higher than warm season. We're going to come back and split that out a little bit. Legumes can be higher quality than grasses at comparable stages of maturity. As a grass heads out to produce seed, the digestibility just goes down very quickly. Legumes, on the other hand, and especially what we would call a non-determinate or an indeterminate legume, that's a plant that can have new vegetative growth, new blooms, pollinated blooms, seed development, all simultaneously happening. And so a legume like that goes to full maturity, but still has very good quality because its other parts of the plant are continuing to grow to produce new growth. So that's a very desirable characteristic. All right, now we're going to split it out, energy and protein. Energy, annuals greater than perennials, legumes greater than grasses, cool season grasses, warm season grasses equal at comparable stages of maturity. And at this point, I would say, as I look at these warm season grasses, I am thinking native warm season grasses, not introduced subtropicals like Bermuda, and none others come to my mind at the moment, but they're out there. The native warm season grasses tend to be maintain their digestibility higher as they advance into maturity. There's probably a little bit of big blue stem, some Indian grass around here, native tall grasses, because the tall grass prairie extended all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, basically. But now we think of it more as in Kansas, Nebraska, Dakotas. The native grasses there are just darn good feed, you know, as they go to maturity. Bermuda grass is not. Bahia grass is not. Klein grass is not. We look at protein. Annuals, generally higher than perennials. Legumes, higher than grasses, way higher. You know, it's that white clover that was out in the pastures where we were this morning, that was probably 20 to 24% crude protein. The mature warm season grasses were probably 6 to 8. The immature warm seasons, 10, 12 maybe. We had orchard grass out there that wasn't heading. You know, it was probably 14. The fescue, 14, 15. And then cool season perennial grasses, warm season perennial grasses. I do not know of any warm season perennial grass that at a comparable stage of maturity is ever higher in protein than a cool season perennial grass at comparable stage of maturity. So let's think about annual forages and winter annuals. This is the South. Your cool season is not all that long. You know, our cool season is 12 months of the year. Not every year, but about that. Here, warm season grasses truly do go dormant because you do have a strong, cool season, not a frigid winter like ours, but it gets cold, warm seasons stop growing. You can get double duty on those warm season acres by having winter annuals either seeded into it or naturally recurring in it. And what they do, it extends the grazing season later into the fall, but also, first time I did that, but also it lets you get cattle out on pasture much earlier in the spring. If you're waiting for the warm season, you know, to come and be grazable, I don't know, that might be the 1st of May here, as opposed to a winter annual where it might be the 1st of March that you could be on it. And then, key thing, it provides finishing or dairy quality feed at a time of year when you normally don't have it. When I talk about pasture finishing, I talk about your finishing window. What is your optimum season for actually getting cattle finished and going to harvest. And sometimes your warm season, the quality has gone out of it, your cattle aren't gaining, but if you have a cool season component in there, it can give you another month or two of finishing quality feed on the backside of summer. And it can also give it to you earlier in the season. What can summer annuals do? Well, guess what? Provide productive forage in midsummer, and finishing quality feed. You know, almost any of these warm season grasses are finishing quality at some point in time, and if you ask the animals, only to eat a certain proportion of it. Something else that a lot of people don't think about warm season annuals for, though, is winter feed. You can grow a tremendous amount of low to mid quality forage that's adequate for a beef cow as a warm season annual during the growing season, and then carry it forward into the winter. Now, out west, and by out west I'm going to say anywhere basically west from like Grand Island, Nebraska, Pierce, South Dakota, Oklahoma City, we're dry enough in the fall and winter that you can take that warm season grass, put it into a swath, and graze it all winter. And when you put it into a swath, it just locks in the quality of what that plant was at when you swathed it. So believe it or not, in the cold west and the cold northern plains, warm season forages are becoming one of our most important winter grazing resources. But we're grazing it out of a swath, not off the stump. So when we look at annual pastures, cool season, warm season, when they are green and growing, they are adequate quality for any class of livestock we want to throw out there. Finishing lambs, finishing cattle, dairy cows. It is good stuff. Sorghum Sudan. It was talked about earlier today. When sorghum Sudan is mid-thigh high, that is finishing quality feed. When it's head high, not so much, unless you ask them to eat maybe only 20% of it. And then we can let some other class of animal clean it up. Cereal rye is the same thing. Super high quality in March, finishing quality feed, but when it gets a head on it, basically it's standing brown manure. That's the best thing to do with it, is turn it into a soil amendment rather than animal feed. As you make the annual, and here I was actually saying cover crop, as you increase the diversity in that annual mix or cover crop, it's generally going to broaden out the season of high quality grazing. It's going to give a better balanced nutrition, because that's what we generally get from diversity. And then we just factor in the stimulus that it gives to soil biology, and cover crops, whether they're predominantly warm season growing through the summer or a cool season growing over the winter, they're good for the soil, good for the livestock, and can be very good for your bottom line. Now, there is such a thing as spending too much money to create your cover crop, and then the return that you have to get from it, man, you've got to really push it to make sure that it's giving you the value that you were looking for. Grazing cover crops, as soon as you graze it off, you start that recovery, and that does the quality curve. The next consideration is plant part, and this one is really simple. Leaves are better quality than stems are. The first bite that the animal takes off the pasture is going to be the highest amount of nutrition that it's going to consume. So, first bite, leaves with low fiber. Second bite, declining leaf-stem ratio. What about this third bite? That third bite does not belong to the livestock. The third bite belongs to the soil, the plant and the soil. Again, just an illustration of where quality is distributed through the plant. This is Jason Roundtree's work from Michigan State, and this is crude protein. The blue bar is the bottom of the plant, red bar is the middle third, green bar is the top third. And this then would be digestibility, or TDN over here. You can see, especially with protein, the top of the plant is substantially higher in protein than the bottom. Energy is always going to be higher in the top. And this is the steepness of these steps is going to change based on what the plant maturity is. Cool season grasses commonly used: rye, oats, wheat, barley. So it's the cereal grains and then annual ryegrass. And of all of these, oats and annual ryegrass are probably my favorites. Winter annual legumes, there's a list of them there. In this part of the country, pretty well all of those will grow. And you know what? If you want diversity in your mixture, why not use all of them rather than just one of them? Brassicas, the turnips, kale, Swedes, radishes. Summer annual grasses, what's corn? Corn is just a big summer annual grass, and it can be grazed as a grass. Greg Brand's second most favorite grass, crabgrass right there. It is a wonderful, wonderful forage. Other ones are in there. I got the weedy grasses, the foxtails, barnyard grass at the bottom. Summer annual legumes, Lespedeza, soybeans, cowpeas, different things there. So warm season covers, they're high in energy and protein during the active growing season. Interesting thing, and so they're good for any class of livestock. As the summer progresses, they might still look kind of green and lush, but they are going to be lower in energy because there's less photosynthesis going on with warm season grasses as you get later in the season, and they become more cow-calf, replacement heifer type feed. Things here, summer annuals can grow explosively. Be aware of that. And the guideline I use for grazing summer annuals, like the sorghum Sudan, the millets, stuff like that, is knees to hip. You want to be grazing them before they hit your hips, and you don't want to graze them any lower than your knee. You keep it in that height range, and you will get good production, good performance out of it. When the forage is twice as tall as the cow, it's kind of out of control. But the thing about them is they will ride a lot of this stuff down and strip the leaves off of it. You do typically, that's the hip to knee picture there. That's a real good grazing stage for warm season covers. Remember, we're trying to build soil. You don't build soil if you don't leave anything behind. And so generally what we're recommending is if you are in a wet environment growing a cover crop like this, you want to leave at least a ton of biomass out there for building soil. In a dry environment, 1,200 pounds. This is in far, far western Kansas. And sometimes 1,200, 1,400 pounds is all the yield's going to be, which means if you are there to build soil with these things, you're only letting the animals take off 200 to 400 pounds. That isn't a whole lot, but we got to leave it there if we want to have the results we're looking for. Talked about this yesterday. How do we create excellent pasture, high quality pasture, whether we're talking about annuals or perennials? It's short grazing periods, appropriate residual, adequate recovery, broadened biodiversity, strengthened soil health, and once again, just under the wire.
All right, I've got a question for you.
Yes.
The pasture walk today in that field, would you recommend a cover crop in that field?
All right. Would I recommend a cover crop in that field? On the top side of that field, you've got enough diversity, enough going on that, no, I wouldn't. You just have enough going. Well, you might throw some vetch, some annual ryegrass, crimson clover maybe. I would not go with a full-blown cover crop out there, but you might add some strategic components like that. On the downhill side, I think you can make a little stronger argument for putting a cover, and so right now seeding a winter cover mix out there to just create some more biomass, because what that red clay needs is growing roots more days of the year and enough volume of forage being produced that we're happy to waste some and tramp it in there.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. Anybody else? here.
Jim, you mentioned something about the difficulty of winter calving. Can you speak to performance, spring calving, fall calving, and then also weaning age?
Okay. Winter calving, spring calving, fall calving. Because my impression is you don't have real winter here, I'm a little less concerned about the calendar date on which you begin grazing. The main thing is that we want, because the highest nutrient requirement of the cow-calf pair is the last 3-4 weeks of gestation, going up to peak lactation, and peak lactation is usually 45 to 70 days post-calving. At 90 days of age, the calf has transitioned from being milk dependent to being forage dependent. Yes, it's still getting milk. Yes, it's still using milk after that. But that is when we have our peak demand. And so I look at, or you should look at your situation. When do you have your, a high volume of high quality forage? That's when you want peak lactation and rebreeding to occur. So you back up 60 to 90 days from that, and that becomes your optimum calving window. I am a strong advocate of short, tight calving seasons. 45 days is what I generally recommend to people. Had we stayed in Missouri with the cow herd that we had, I was fully prepared to go to a 30-day calving season. If you have good functional cattle and you have them matched properly to your forage supply curve, 85–90% of your calves should be dropping in the first cycle, first 21 days. So why spread it out for 60 days, 90 days, when you can have it that tight, which makes life easier for you, gives you a more easily marketable calf crop. So is that winter calving, spring calving, fall calving? For a lot of folks, that's going to be spring calving. If you have already mastered year-round grazing and you have good quality winter grazing, I'm a big fan, this far south, I'm a big fan of fall calving because it puts your marketing counter-cyclical to most of the calf and yearling supply in this country. But in my view, the only way fall calving works is if you have already mastered grazing through the winter. In Missouri for us, and remember, we were in North Missouri, probably, I'm going to say, 300 miles north of here. Maybe it's 200, I'm not sure. I haven't looked at the map real close lately. But 200 to 300 miles north, and we were able to run fall calving cows through the entire winter with no supplementation. And in our environment up there, it was the cheapest way that you could grow a pound of beef over the winter was with a fall calving cow.
Next question.
Yeah.
Great.
What about selectivity? I know you focus more on time than space, but with more space, they do have some more selectivity. Just address the selectivity. I don't think I caught it in the slides.
You did not. I said we ask the animals to eat a little less. That's allowing more selection. If you need high performance, like for, choice grade, 100% grass-fed cattle, there will be many times of the year that you have to allow some level of selective grazing so to ensure that they're getting the energy intake that they need. In cow-calf, I am generally managing for minimal selection opportunity. I look, our pastures, both when we were on the farm in Missouri and in the pastures, irrigated pastures in Idaho, everything out there is good enough that I'm perfectly happy to ask them to eat it all. Now, eating it all doesn't mean going to the ground. Those of you who've heard me over the years know that I've historically been a strong take half, leave half advocate. On irrigated pasture, because I know I'm going to make it rain 3/4 of an inch every third day, I graze more severely. I do a lot of 60 to maybe even up 65% utilization now because I know I can make it grow right back. In Missouri, if I utilized beyond 50%, that was only going on stockpiled pastures where we weren't expecting regrowth, or if we were working towards actually damaging a pasture so that we could seed something into it, then we would graze it abusively. But in this part of the world, I would consider take half, leave half pretty good year, good grazing management. In the winter, a little more severely. Drought in the summer, a little lighter.
What about animal density? Do you have any preferences on that?
On animal density? Okay. So, yeah, I like the optimal stock density, which depends on how much forage do you have, what's the target utilization rate, what's the animal need to eat, and how long do you need to feed them on that spot for. If you have that information, you can calculate the optimal density. In Missouri, we ran a lot of 30 to 60,000, and high for us in Missouri would have been 80,000. We routinely run 70 to 110,000 on the pivots in Idaho, and like I had some rank forage this year that I had to work through, and we went through that at 120 to 140,000. I have had stockpile that I have done at 200,000, and that's 24-hour moves. So, and tomorrow I'm going to talk about pasture inventory and animal unit days. Another reason I like working with animal unit days is if you drop 3 zeros off, divide by 1,000, whatever your stock density is how many AUDs per acre you've harvested. And if you have an inventory and you're projecting how many AUDs you're going to harvest off a field, you know that's the stock density that you're going to be using. All right. Better end it?
Okay, yep.
All right, thank you very much.
Dan.